So today we're going to be presented on the book The Weavers of the Revolution, The Yarur Workers and Chile's Road to Socialism by Peter Winn. So I'm going to start by introducing the book, and to start I'm going to introduce what the Yarur mill was. So the Yarur mill was a cotton mill started by Juan Yarur, which was a Palestinian immigrant, and he was brought over by the Alessandri government to start a cotton mill in Santiago because he had started a cotton mill in Bolivia that had been very successful, and Alessandri was trying to modernize the country's industry and brought him over. The Yarur mill was important and symbolic. It was important because it was the nation's largest cotton textile plant, and it supplied the armed forces, hospitals, flour mills, and the population at large with cotton products. And it was symbolic because for a lot of the entrepreneurial class and the capitalist class, it symbolized the creativity and contribution of Chile's new capitalist class. And they even developed a saying of tan rico como un Yarur, which means as rich as a Yarur, saying how the heads of this factory had become so rich through state-led capitalism. And this book talks about the events of Monday the 26th of April 1971, where the cotton mill gets taken over by workers. So the book itself can be seen as a microhistory of a factory study, which is a microcosm of the political and economic changes in Chile. So the book treats about the history of the factory and the worker movements within it and how it developed, but it's also a microcosm of how Chile was changing at the time. So one of the first things that it treats is a conflicting view of entrepreneurship and state capitalism. So Yarur was a state-controlled monopoly, and how we learned in class, a lot of industrial development that occurred in Latin America happened through state-led capitalism that led to inefficient monopolies. And it depended on state funding, cheap loans, protective tariffs, and cheap foreign exchange, and favorable regulations provided by the government. So that makes Yarur a classic example of import substitution led by state-led capitalism. And it also had the ideas of paternalistic labor organizations and industrialization at the cost of the people at large, because it was very inefficient, so the products were very expensive and the state had to put in a lot of money to modernize. It's also a microcosm of Chile's development because it shows the workers' struggle in the workplace. So it's how the workers struggle to receive unit rights and better working conditions, and how they had to fight a state-backed patron, which is sort of the head of the factory that was supported by the state to keep the workers oppressed. And it shows how in the factory itself started a movement for the workers' demands to become more salient in the community, which is very similar to how the lower strata's demands had to become more influential in the political sphere in Chile. So the book's hypothesis is that the Yarur takeover marked the turning point of the Chilean Revolution, and its workers were a central protagonist for this drama. This has to do with how the day-to-day effect of worker movements placed pressure on Allende's government to conduct more revolution from above and socialize more of these factories so they could be taken over by workers and distribute the wealth of the nation more rapidly. So the author's description of their own book is that this is their story, meaning the workers, which I have tried to tell as much as possible through their eyes and their words. So in very many parts, Peter Winn uses interviews and direct quotation from workers to sort of give a very all-encompassing idea of how developments were happening in the factory. And finally, he says that this book is the story of the birth and death of the dream, meaning how the idea of trying to give Chile's wealth back to the workers sort of started and died with the worker movements in the factory and also with Allende's government. So there's a mirror image of worker movements and Allende's governments and trying to give Chile's wealth back to its people. So the first chapter is called Origins, Capital, Labor, and the State. So I'm going to start with capital, which has to do with the Yarurs. So the first part is called Palestinians in the Promised Land, and it starts with Yarur's arrival from Bolivia. So Juan Yarur was born in Ottoman Palestine, immigrated to Bolivia in 1914. 1929, he opened a cotton mill in Bolivia, and where he learned about how state-led capitalism was the ruling way of making industry in Latin America. For this, Peter Winn says the Yarur Bolivian mill was not just a school for industrialists, it was a school for Latin American industrialists, because it was an example of state-led capitalism, which in the way that the Yarur exploited the Bolivian state for subsidized exchange rates, and he also learned about the importance of securing political influence to be able to get his way in the industry and using the state to benefit himself. He gets invited by President Alessandri in an attempt to modernize the nation's industries. This is because between 1929 and 1932, the value of Chile's export had fallen by 88%. Real wages had fallen by 40%, so Alessandri was trying to modernize the country's economy. This is also, again, just to repeat, it's an example of state-led capitalism. The Yarur factory was financed almost entirely by the Chilean government. There was $1 million loan from the Banco de Chile. Machinery was imported duty-free and a long-term credit. And on this, Peter Winn says the Chilean road to industrialization had been constructed and paid by the state and paid by the consumers in the form of higher prices. So this has also to do with how Yarur is a perfect example of the faults of state-led capitalism in Latin America. And finally, this treats the interaction between Juan Yarur and his sons and how the factory was treated. So Juan Yarur was very paternalist, and he treated his workers in a very hierarchical way that we will explain later in the second part of the book. But essentially, he dies in a car accident and he gives his factory to his sons, one of which, Jorge, institutes the tailor system, which we're going to talk about more, but essentially it's an efficiency improving system that monitors workers' every move. And this contradicts the system of paternalism. And this shows how later on there will be conflicts in the factory that will lead to the socialization of the factory itself. But essentially, what is important is that by 1970, the Yarur mill is a picture of the Chilean state-led capitalist system. It has monopoly over the textile industry in Chile. It is inefficient. It is inefficient and it hasn't been modernized in a while. And finally, the Yarur, by that point, are one of the 11 industrial clans that dominate Chile. So it has to show how Chile's economy was very oligopolistic. So later on, the labor issue is that there's two different groups in the Yarur mill, the old-timers and the youngsters. So the old-timers were from Juan Yarur's father's time, which were used to paternalism. Less demanding system was work because they weren't used to the tailor system. And they were used to a lot of failed strikes, like the 1962 strike, where they striked against the working conditions in the factory, but the state actually backed the capitalists, which shows also the nature of state-led capitalism in Latin America. They were personally recruited by Juan Yarur, and they were bound to good behavior by loyalty to the patron, which was Juan Yarur. But when he died, this was changed and led to more opportunities for socialization. The youngsters were used to Amador's mill, which was the other brother. They were used to the rest of the tailor system, and they had never experienced labor conflict. And because of the tide of rural migration, they had ideas of socialism, which also influenced the developments of the factory. So we see a switch in this towards profitability over paternalism. So the long-term loyalty to the patron was replaced with supervisors from universities and consultants from America, from the US, through the introduction of the tailor system, which broke down the hierarchies of the patron system. And finally, this leads to worker movements. So in the strike of '62, it was fueled by the youngsters' ideas and old-timers' interest in the labor question in the way that they wanted to secure a free union system. And finally, in 1962, as I said before, Yarur is able to restore social control with government assistance. And finally, this leads to what is going to come in. So Alessandri sends the military to back up the capitalists, and 11 workers are fired. 1,000 workers are fired, which shows how the state always backs up the capitalists, and how when Allende gets elected, this might change, presenting an opportunity for a revolution. So the final element is the state, which are the political developments in Chile at the time. So this is how Allende gets elected. So one of the two very important things are the structural change that happened to Chile's democracy at that time. So the electorate doubled between 1952 and 1970, with many coming from lower strata, which are more bound to support the left. In 1962, voting registration becomes obligatory, encouraging effective working class suffrage. By that point, urbanization is at 70%. So in 1970, 70% of the Chilean population lives in the city, with most of them living in Santiago under pretty terrible working conditions. And at that point, 20 to 30% of workers are unionized, with the majority being affiliated to Marxist-led unions. So this was also complemented with a dissatisfaction with Chilean politics. So traditional populist reforms such as the radicals and Carlos Ibáñez had been discredited because import substitution had shown to fail. Chile's economy kept on in chronic decline, and there was a lot of examples of corruption and bureaucracy. Also in 1958, Alessandri, which was a business-friendly capitalist, did not manage to actually give economic prosperity to Chile, and he ruled over stagflation despite an attempt to modernize Chile, which we see with actually him bringing Yarur over to Chile. And finally, reform also failed because Frei, which was a Christian Democrat, which tried to institute state-led reformed capitalism, also failed because he couldn't provide land reform quick enough, and a lot of the state back-end capitalism was exploited and ended up not actually benefiting the people of Chile. So finally, this leads to a turn left and the rise of Allende. By 1970, 1/3 of organized peasants had joined Marxist unions, and the MAPU, which was a part of the Christian Democrats that were more left-leaning, broke up and joined the left. And this makes that in 1969 there is the forming of the Popular Unity Government, which is a coalition of leftists that includes communists, socialists, the radicals, and the left-leaning MAPU. And they allow Allende to run as their representative for the presidency, and he wins 36.3% of the vote in the 1970 election. And I think a very important quote is one by Teitelbaum that says, Allende was chosen because he was the voice of the people, because if you spoke with a peasant or worker in Valdivia or in Magallanes, they said, well, of course the candidate has to be Salvador Allende, which shows how Allende was supported by the people. This shows an increase in mass politics and mass electorate politics rather than elite politics, which had dominated Chile before. So finally, Allende gets elected, so I'm just going to introduce his government. He was born in 1908 in Valparaiso, and he had been committed to the left his entire life. He wrote his doctoral thesis in 1932 on the social causes of ill health, and he quotes, "My studies taught me that socialism was the only solution to these problems, and that Chile had to find its own road." So we can see that from very early on in his life, he's inspired by the idea of socialism. So he was elected to Congress in 1937. In 1938, he was the Minister of Health for Pedro Aguirre Cerda's left-leaning government. So his main ideology is the idea of the Chilean road to socialism. So he was committed to the unity of the left, which is that, and he quotes, "The success of the popular movement in Chile depends on the unity of the parties of the working class." So he's very committed in mass politics, grassroots movements that support politicians, and not an idea of the elites ruling from above without the people. And his main quote is he wants to make a revolución con sabor a vino tinto y empanadas, which is wine and, I guess, pastries, which are very typical to Chilean working class people. So there's very much a Chilean flavor to his revolution, and he's a populist in this way, and that appeals to the working classes. And finally, his movement is democratic, whereas it is a revolution, but he wants to do everything through the democratic institutions of the country, and that'll show, that we'll see later, will provide different constraints and opportunities for him. And finally, the last thing is that it's a truly grassroots movement that is crowdfunded by masses. People support him, and the working class supports him all throughout, rather than being supported by big money and big states and elites. And that's about it.
Okay. You got this? Yeah, good. Okay, so in this chapter we're going to focus on the rise of the workers' movement within the Yarur factory from time period 1969 to March 1971. Thank you. Okay, so Amadou Yarur was an extremely insecure man who wanted to maintain a paternalistic relations that was there under his father's regime of the factory, and he tried to accomplish this through a form of social control and using modern industrial techniques. So firstly, he encouraged a culture of loyalty and informing on each other, in which workers were on the factory floor were encouraged to report individual transgressions. This was significant because it meant that individual workers could not trust each other or talk to each other, which made organising very difficult. Also, he tried to give gifts de la patron. He gave gifts such as he gave raises on certain days, and he provided paid for education for workers' children and organised the building of housing complexes. This helped create like a form of gratitude, which was also another form of social control. And though he couldn't fire people under the current Christian democratic legislation, he was able to dish out certain punishments like docking pay, suspensions, or making them work in not very nice areas like the pool where you clean toilets in the lower levels and stuff like that. And all this was significant because it created a workforce that was passive and loyal and could continue to be exploited without complaint. Okay, but this all changed under the youngsters. As was mentioned before, there was a kind of division between the reds and the yellows and the youngsters and the old-timers. However, due to rural migration in around the time period of 1969, Amador had to hire from urban areas rather than rural ones. And this is significant because youngsters from these areas were more likely to be educated and had more confidence. And they were less influenced by conservative influences like the Catholic Church or family. They were more influenced by their social group, their peers, and through talking in social clubs and sports clubs, etc. This was significant because it helped create a class identity. And moreover, due to living in a city, they grew up in a cosmopolitan lifestyle, which gave them higher material aspirations. So when they entered the Yarur system, they clashed with it and fought for change. Okie dokie. After the Yarur strike in 1962, the union became company-owned. This meant that it was staffed fully by Yarur loyalists, and the elections were rigged, and any form of collective bargaining was completely for show. It was completely orchestrated. It was prohibited to even discuss the establishment of an independent union, and this lack of representation was intolerable to the new youngsters entering the tailor system. And by 1969, an insurgency was born to free the union. Over time, the followers are gathered, but it was still very slow. By 1969, there was only 10 followers of the insurgency. And they started producing like propaganda pamphlets in the form of La Firma. Outside the factory floor, it was distributed and produced. They could not go inside just yet. But this would all change with the campaign for Allende, precisely. So at the same time this insurgency was going on to free the Union, the campaign of Allende was ongoing. The insurgency came to identify with Allende and tied their ability to succeed to Allende being elected. They needed government protection for their union to succeed because it could not survive within Amador's system of social control. And in 1970, Allende paid an unprecedented campaign visit to the factory. Amador normally wouldn't allow this, but he wanted to hedge his bets due to the popularity of Allende in case he won. In front of him, Allende promised to the workers that if he won, the government would seize control of the factory. This was very significant because it proved a great boost to morale to the growing insurgency and put many more followers in their corner. Lovely. Okay, in September 1970, Allende won the presidential election. This was a popular triumph for the insurgents, who made their movement public and campaigning far more openly for the upcoming union elections in December. In contrast, Amador was hesitant for once about firing those who questioned his policies and wanted to undermine him. But, and this just gave the leaders of the movement more confidence, as well as watchdog movements were formed under the guidance of socialist advisors. They were formed to guard against industrial sabotage and gather information about the elites at the top, which creates a situation in which the workers were overseeing their bosses rather than the other way around. Then for the election, the union election in December 1970, the union election was 5 places. If the insurgents captured 3, they'd have control of the union and would be able to free it. Yeah, and when the election happened, the candidates won by a landslide with over 80% of the vote in their corner. They got 3 places, so the union was effectively freed. And the first case of collective bargaining was witnessed in decades, with the forming of a new contract which gained a 45% increase in wages, a 30-minute paid lunch break, and served to break the system of social control that Amador had tried to establish. And now we talk about the white-collar workers in the factory. In the same months, 500 of them gathered and formed their own union in the firm. Okay. Their concerns were different from the working class movement. They were more materialistic in aims. They considered themselves middle class and wanted to have the wages to achieve all the material comforts that they thought the middle class deserved. But the main challenge was to be legally ratified, like in the eyes of the government, so that Amador could not do anything against them. And the success of this was largely down to dependence on the government. Their application for union status was fast-tracked by the sympathetic A&A government in like 2 days. But Amador's attempt to create a company union with staff by loyalists was met with bureaucratic death. Overall, by April 1971, 2 unions had arisen to challenge the control of the Yarur family. This set the stage for future challenges and to the factory, and ultimately challenges to control the factory.
Yeah.
Okay. So this chapter now explains how the workers have forced radicalization of the Chilean revolution nationally. So when Allende was elected, the workers saw it as their own victory, and for them it was finally the opportunity to take the revolution into their own hands and to pursue their dreams. So the workers, peasants, and pobladores had faith in the Unidad Popular. However, after the election, Allende did very little, and he was very slow to implement the program of structural transformation. And therefore, young people and working class were really frustrated, and yeah, as everything was too slow. So with this passive political base, they had to turn into active agents of change, and they became protagonists of the revolutionary process. So on one side, this election was a signal for the workers to start to get organized and have wages increases and socialization of the workplace. And on the other side, there was La Toma, which were like waves of suburban land seizures and farm seizures. And this La Toma is what most worried Unidad Popular, because this rural revolution from below was destroying a little bit the Unidad Popular's image and also their timetable, because everything was going too quickly, like from below. So by April 1971, the revolution from below was threatening to exclude the leftist national leaders, and it forced the Unidad Popular to revise their strategy. And the question was reform or revolution. So the thing is, because the UP leaders were scared that if the workers' expectations were not satisfied, then enthusiasm for socialism would fade away. So this would either be fatal for the left wing, or workers would stay unsatisfied and ally with competitors to the left. So the Yarur workers were consolidating unions, gathering data, and they couldn't wait, so they were going to go forwards because they didn't want to risk to lose their dynamism. So with this, the UP had no choice, and in order to prevent the revolution from above to get out of hand, the government had to radicalize their revolution from above and to accompany the movement from below. So that's how the revolution from below became a catalyst for revolution from above. So now the next part is why did they choose precisely Yahud? So there's lots of different reasons. So first of all, the UP had socialized industries before, but it was always exceptions because either they were inefficient or they had committed offenses, etc. And however, they wanted to socialize the textile industry because it was a monopoly and they wanted to act really seriously against monopoly. And Yahud was the first monopoly to be incorporated in the social property area. So the Yahud supported strongly, the Yahud family, supported strongly the left wing, and they really represented the concentration of power and dominance of Chile by special interest. And it's exactly what the UP wanted to stop, to destroy. And furthermore, the Yahud mill had questionable practices such as tax evasion, currency violations, and etc., which were additional good reasons to justify that the government would seize the factory. Also, Yahud had Arab roots, as we mentioned, and so none of them had actual Chilean citizenship. So it means that they wouldn't, the Yahud family wouldn't really have the popular support because they were not really Chilean. So it would mean that the government would have the popular support. And lastly, there was a very strong unicity of the workers, as there was a representation of three major parties of Unidad Popular among the workers, and they were very united in a common cause. So the government knew that even if they didn't choose the Yahud mill, the workers would go ahead with them and seize the factory. So that's why the Yahud was the best factory to seize. Yep. Okay, so this chapter unfolds the actual factory seizing. So by April's elections, the leaders of workers' movement at Yahud were ready. However, they were being more and more ignored, and their authority was challenged. There was a decline in production and stocks, and a rumor of firing 200 employees. The government there shared the leaders' goals, but they were scared, and therefore they were too slow. On the other side, the Ministry of Economy was between the workers' desire for immediate action, but also their own fears of complications and consequences. But the socialist leaders, they supported and trusted the workers, as it was best to see Yahud fall from below, because if it was just the government that took it down, and it would just be a change of bosses. So that's why it had also be done by the workers. So the leaders of Yahud decided that in order to move things, they needed a radical break, a confrontation. So they made a list of demands to Armando Yahud that was impossible, but seemed reasonable for the workers. And so on the day that Armando Yahud had to give an answer to these demands, he said no, and the Yahud leaders met with Allende, and Allende gave no support to the workers and forbid them to go ahead with the factory seizing. And then also the Yahud leaders met with the Ministry of Economy, and they gave them support. So there's a total lack of political unitary direction, and so therefore the workers were just free to pursue their revolution from below, and they went ahead. So on a Sunday, it was finally the day of seizure, and everyone was revolted. And even the old-timers that always had bad experience of strikes, they followed, as they knew this time it was different. It was different because in appearance they were voting just for a strike, which was like compromising Yahud on Armando Yahud on union demands, but the real aim was seizing the factory. And so actually a lot of workers had no idea of what was really happening, but they just wanted to go forward without really knowing what's going to happen. And so also one important thing is that the workers seized the factory from the outside, so it wasn't a real toma, and this was very important because if they had seized it from inside, the law could have made the workers prisoners and it would have ruined the entire process. So once more, it really shows that the workers were very organized and they thought about everything. And just to mention also, during the seizing, everyone was very happy. It was like almost like a party. They were saying like a carnival, everyone was happy. So after, like on that day, Allende was furious that the workers went ahead, even though he was against it. And it was the first real conflict between Allende and his central mass base. After we said that he was really close to the mass, that was the first big conflict. And so Allende met with the Yarur leaders, and he still insisted that there would be no requisition from the state. And so the ministers of economy said that they were with the workers and they threatened to resign if the government didn't go ahead with the requisition. So after a long decision, Allende had to decide to make the requisition. And finally, in April 28th, it was finally the day of liberation. So the government and the Unidad Popular agreed to formally intervene in the industry. So again, there was a huge joy. Everyone was crying. Everyone was so happy, and all the workers couldn't even realize that all their action that had begun like a few years ago with just little workers with dreams had turned into a big revolutionary process. So it was finally the liberation. Yep. Sorry, there was a thing before. And here you can see, yeah, you can move after.
Okay.
Yeah. Here it's a little drawing of Yarur, and this is Armando Yarur that is like just lost his factory, and he's very sad. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so we control 90% of what were the private banks. We are able to save our copper, our coal, our iron, our nitrates, our steel. The fundamental space of heavy industry today belongs to Chile and the Chileans. And that was what Allende said on the first year of his election anniversary. And it was in accordance with the events at the Yarur mile that we may now call ex-Yarur, you can see there. And this was followed by the beginning of the democratization of the working system and of the patronal system at the mill. And workers became managers, and it later became an example for Allende's government as the glorious revolution from below. And so as you can see on the pictures, workers were holding election to elect leaders. On the other side, they started to produce popular fabrics for the people of Chile, and this was the sign of the democratization of the production. And as a whole, this gave more dignity to the workers that were not anymore Don Almador people, but ex-Yarur workers, and it increased their self-esteem. This also introduced a revolutionary fever in the mill, and its populists became reformers and radical revolutionaries. Meetings were more sophisticated and more tumultuous. On the other side, this also introduced the national problems into the unions and in the factory. And as nationally, it plagued the popular unity of Allende, because the country was already suffering from an economic crisis, and the popular unity was starting to get divided. So realization of a dream. Well, ex-Yarur demonstrated the viability of a new participatory democracy, but beyond the factory gates, forces were opposing their dreams and turned them into nightmares. Therefore, in 1972, economic dislocation, class conflict, and political polarization made Chile was advancing toward socialism or civil war, and so the country everything was really tense, and economic difficulties and social tension made the unification of the working class more difficult for Allende. On the other side, in October '72, there has been a patronal paro, which was undertook by the capitalists and the Yankee imperialism, which was like the influence of the United States, that was dropping money in the country to finance the counter movement, the counter socialism movement, which was incarnated by the classic elite. And however, the working class successfully responded to it through, for example, the cordones industrial that started to replace all the roles that were still in the hand of the elite to make the country work even during the paro patronal. And a year later, in '73, elections were held, and it discounted political accommodation for both sides. The Christian Democrats replaced their moderate leadership with a coup team in association with the right. And by July, Allende's strategy, which was relying on the help of General Prats, which was a constitutional ally within the army, failed, and Pratt resigned and was replaced by Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, which later became the ruler of the country. So this marked the disillusion of the working class, which became confused, divided, and demoralized, and ex-Yarur dreams are sacrificed on the altar of an undeclared, unwanted, and unwinnable civil war. So in September '73, protestation was held. They were claiming that Allende, el pueblo te defiende, which means that the people are with you, Allende. But the support of a mobilized working class could no longer deter the military coup. And on the 11th of September '93, Allende is assassinated, and his road to socialism and ex-Yarur revolution from below are condemned with him. And so during the weeks that followed, 25,000 Chileans were killed. The junta imposed martial law. Unions are proscribed. Leftist leaders are killed, imprisoned, or driven underground. In the mine, activists are purged from the labor force. And in 1974, Amardo Yarur comes back to the mill and takes charge of his old family mine, and repressive methods are back with him, which we saw earlier. So the capitalist revolution is complete. They killed the dream of many workers, as Berta Castillo, that lost her job, her home, and her husband to the coup. And with the victory of Pinochet, Chile's enterprise were back in the hand of their old owners, The Yarur workers paid an heavy price for their role in the workers' movement, and this nationally was followed by a massive increase in poverty, and 10 years later the mine collapsed because of its debt and unviable production due to the free market laws imposed by Pinochet. In 1985, Pinochet is ousted by a democratic referendum. The 55% no for Pinochet wins and forced him to resign, and the election took place a year later after a revision of the constitution. So that's it. Thank you.